Nice to be with you this morning. As Sam said, my name is Scott. And I remember many of you, a lot of friendly faces. We worshiped here with my family for quite some time. My wife and son made it today. The one girl wasn't able and the other's out of town, but it's nice to be back. It's really nice to see everybody, and it's my pleasure to be your substitute teacher, so to speak, for the day. I am no Chris Bohr, but I'll do my best, all right? It's actually really fun. I love the topic that Chris is going through. He got on a call with Logan Brown and myself and sort of elaborated on the big themes. It would have made a nice little podcast maybe. Those guys are really smart. They have great things to say. But it was an unusual time because I find myself now sometimes being the old guy. So it was sort of fun. We were like reminiscing discoveries about God, and I mentioned that, this one discovery, I watched an R.C. Sproul VHS tape when I was in college. It was fantastic. They're just laughing, I had to get off the Zoom call a little early, and I ended it saying, "Get off my lawn, boomer out," and hit the leave button. So I'm not really a boomer, but it felt appropriate. I kind of enjoyed being the old guy. So, but my pleasure to sub in today. Good to see everyone. And I just want to share a few thoughts on Mark 6 in alignment with everything that Chris has planned. And I really love the mission statement of this church. Worship the King around the table for the life of the world. I don't know a better mission statement. You guys nailed that one. We, Chris, us back then. I don't know how that formed, but it's really good. And it just fits. This sequence in the lectionary lends itself to picking through this mission statement. And so I would encourage us, here's a framework maybe to follow along this passage. Think of this whole series of texts in the gospel from the last few weeks and the next few coming as like a Netflix series with 11 episodes. Maybe you've seen something like that. So picture it that way. It all runs together. It's a great season. It's a season of Netflix episodes, and today is one of those episodes. That might be a helpful framework, and we'll kind of fit it. I'm not going to say much about what came before or after. We're going to really look at this episode, but see it in the bigger picture as if it's a series. If I were going to title this Netflix show, I think I'd just title it The Bread. And maybe as a subtitle, Worship the King around the table for the life of the world. It really works. It's not like forcing that in there. That's the text that you all have been working through. So here's how I would invite us to see Mark 6, 45 through 52 today. For this episode, let's imagine it starts with a flashback. You know how a lot of times episodes do that? So consider the last verse of our text this morning first. Here it is. For they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. That's how our episode, I'm going to invite us to look at the last word first. Just, I don't know, maybe for theatrical purposes. I think it's helpful in unpacking this whole thing. It's interesting because what was the episode about? It wasn't the loaves. This whole thing was like lost at sea. Maybe that would be like a title for this little episode. What the heck? The last line, they did not understand. Oh, let's look at that first as almost a foreshadowing. Okay, what's going on there? That's your flashback. And then let's kind of dig into this passage. I'm just going to traipse through it a little bit, paraphrase some things, and highlight a few key words. We'll revisit it briefly, and then I would like to ask a couple key questions at the end. Okay, the first word is immediately. If you don't know, it's one of Mark's favorite words. I think it appears like 38 times in the gospel. This thing's moving. It's a fun gospel. It's full of detail, but it's somewhat riveting. So immediately, and this is after the last scene where Jesus did this famous miracle. He fed 5,000 people. He had 12 baskets of bread left over. It's in all four gospels. It's a big deal. That miracle's a big deal. So immediately after, he made his disciples get into a boat, and he's sending them away. He just wants to go pray. I think Jesus is a little tired. He was tired before the feeding of the 5,000. They were going somewhere to rest, and they got flanked. So he's like, guys, get in the boat, head over there. Man, I'm just going to take a minute, I'm going to pray. So it literally says the disciples are in a boat on the sea, and Jesus is on the land. Those two words appear in our text, sea and land. And it's really interesting. The Bible Project did this podcast, a big theme over a year, like 20-some episodes, about some of these very things, like dragons and serpents and sea, and how that really meant something to an ancient culture. It's kind of lost on us. But a Jewish mindset would have seen those two words and go, oh, sea is chaos. That's the dangerous place. Land is safer. That's where we've been given to inhabit. Even think Genesis, So that's almost another little thematic detail in the story. The story has a lot of those little things that can sort of have tentacles that reach into other aspects of God in the Scripture. So this sets the stage. The disciples are out in this dangerous, chaotic place, the sea. Meanwhile, Jesus is in the safe and habitable place where gardens are, like land. And then they're trying to go, and a storm comes up, and it says they're making headway painfully. That sounds pretty bad, especially if you're like a professional seafaring fisherman sort of person that's grown up here. This must have been bad. These guys are stuck. They're making headway painfully. And it's late in the night. And Jesus comes walking on the sea. It's almost casual. That is not a casual thing for anyone to do. So here's the sea, this dangerous trap of chaos, and Jesus is, he's walking. He meant to pass them by. It gets even more casual. And they see him. They think it's a ghost. These guys are terrified. They think it's a ghost. Now they're doubly terrified because as if the sea is not enough and the chaos, the imminent threat, they're so out of their minds, they don't know what they're looking at. They think some sort of apparition is out here, and they're doubly terrified. And what's interesting about this is if you kind of follow those ancient themes of sea and storms, those are the chaos, sort of the friction against God. Those are those elements. And quite often, in like many, many, many pagan religions, there was a storm god. You sort of had to appease him, and he'd take care of the storm, and you'd be safe. And I love what's sort of embedded in here is Jesus is casually doing the thing that the paltry pagan storm gods, like that was their thing. That was their big deal. That was their big showing. The pagan storm god could maybe tame the sea if you really appeased him. But Jesus is just kind of putting that paltry pagan god image to shame by casually just kind of walking by on the sea. It elevates him. We're supposed to see that. We're supposed to see that and learn about this identity of Jesus, especially contrasted to the mind and thought of the day. So they're terrified. They're doubly terrified. Here we have it again. But immediately, he spoke to them. And he says, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." I love that. There's kind of two pieces to that, at least. Take heart and do not be afraid. That is really simple, but how often do you need to hear that? I know I need to hear that. And again, connect that to the line I opened it with, which is actually the last one. They didn't understand the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. So what's Jesus' admonition to them here? Take heart. Don't be afraid. Why can he say that? Because he's casually cruising by, walking on the water, defying the ancient myths of something that was grand. For him, that's sort of nothing. At least that's the way I kind of read this. Then he got in the boat with them, which is another wonderful Jesus-like thing. He didn't need to be appeased. God is transcendent, but he's also immanent. He's Emmanuel, God with us. This is like an act of incarnation and love. He didn't just tell them, take heart and don't be afraid and cruise on out of there. He got in the boat with them. I think it's a beautiful symbol of how God is with us. And then what happens next? The wind ceased. That's all it took. This is great. This is actually the second time Jesus did something like this in Mark. If you're following it in its literary layout, in Mark 4, Jesus calms the storm. The guys are like, who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? By implication, the answer is God. Like the God, almighty over everything that made creation, is now stopping it. And he's in our boat with us. We didn't earn that. We're like scaredy cats and miss the mark and seeing ghosts, and he's in the boat. And then we get that last line, which again, consider that scene, this little lost at sea scene. There's no mention of bread. The last line, explaining why after the wind ceased, the disciples are astounded. They didn't understand the loaves. What? But this all connects. We have a connector episode here. The previous episode in the series was kind of a mid-season peak. Jesus feeds the 5,000. Now we get this little intimate kind of post-peak mini connector episode that sort of harkens back to the loaves, but looks forward to something significant. In that way, it's a bit of a cliffhanger too. You see? If we read that verse last, there's a ... What? Man, I want to see, when's the next episode come out? Next Thursday? I want to see that one because there's something there in the loaves that, what's going on? And you're going to get it. Trust me, the lectionary is very kind to you all. And in the next couple of weeks, this is really fun. It teases this theme out. Okay, so I want to pose two questions. Who is Jesus and how do we relate to him? So we just looked at that story quickly. What do we learn in this episode about, number one, who is Jesus? And number two, how do we relate to him? So I want to ask you to use your imagination for a second and picture I'm kind of holding up a standard white piece of paper, 8.5 by 11. Draw a line, a vertical line right down the center. And on the left side, write, who is Jesus? And make a list. Just what comes to mind after hearing that story. Pick one thing. Even if you come up with one thing, okay? Like actually do it. See this thing, who is Jesus? What's one thing from that story? How would you answer that? Okay. Now on the other side of the ledger, we're going to ask the question, how do we relate to him? At least one thing. What do you think? Consider that episode. How do we relate to him? Okay. You can take longer and meditate on that later if you want. That's kind of quick. Maybe you got one thing. Here's another interesting thing I'm learning from sort of like ancient Hebrew and Jewish mindsets. We often read these things in a very individual way or a Western way where we want the thematic statement up front and bullet points to prove it. These guys were into discovery. Mark and interviewing Peter, and they're telling a story which invites you to discover it. It is not laid out there's a thing in even speaking, like tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. It's not like that. It's not a thematic statement and bullet points. This is a story, and we're invited to step into a story and discover. That's the intent of these things. That's why there's a cliffhanger at the end of this. That's why it's hard to isolate this episode outside of the series. So here's what that's like in this era to understand. We're asking the question, who is Jesus? How do we relate to him? On that page, now, here's kind of the aha moment as an illustration. You fold them together on that line, and they touch each other. That's my best rendition of something I'm learning from a smart guy. Okay, so, but that's sort of beautiful. Think about it. And if you can fold that together, who is Jesus? And how do we relate to him? And you fold that in and they touch. And when you do that, you may discover a better answer to who is Jesus. And a better answer to how do I relate to him? How do people relate to him? How do I personally relate to him? It invites us to close that gap and not be quite as individualistic. And sometimes I think when we make that fold, we may think, hey, I am undone. I'm terrified. Like, yes, I want to come closer. I want to fuse in and almost like glue that fold together. Those two ledgers on one page become one skinny page. Glue me in. Others are like, I don't know. That's maybe a little too close for me. I'm not quite sure I'm proud of myself lately, or there might be some awkwardness or reasons, but I still think that's the invitation. Jesus walked into the boat. Don't let your heart be hard. Don't be afraid. Take heart. He invites us to that. So here are just 3 short things in my little table on who is Jesus and how do we relate. Who is Jesus? Jesus is King, Jesus' table, and Jesus' life. Obviously, that relates to your mission statement. Worship the King around the table for the life of the world. Here's what I mean by that. Jesus is King. And if you throw back even to right before the feeding the 5,000, there's a major contrast. King Herod, exemplifies what not to do as king, a bad king. Jesus exemplifies by contrast and personalizes what a king is. Additionally, this is a nature miracle. The one we just saw on the water, the one before it with bread and fish and multiplying that's a physical, corporeal nature miracle. Who's in charge of created things? The king. So I think we can see, first and foremost, who is Jesus? Jesus is king. I would also say Jesus' table. And by table, I really mean loaves. A lot of times, think about it. When we talk about the table, we really mean about what's on it, like in our sacrament and bread. And that's Jesus giving himself to people, feeding them. And that will be expounded upon. More about that will be in the coming weeks. Jesus' table. And I think Jesus is life. It's a little veiled here, but did he not save their lives? I mean, at least he saved them from their own terror. They wouldn't have been terrified if there wasn't a risk involved. And that's a little bit metaphorical or exemplarizing, but I think it's fair. This is a story. We're supposed to be invited into it and discover things. Jesus inserts life when there's at least a risk of death. That's interesting. Again, put a pin in that one. More to come. So, as a mirror image, here's how I would answer the other question. How do we relate to Jesus? Yield to the King. Feast at his table. And let your heart beat with his life. Do you see the relationship? The mirror image? Can you fold that in on it? If Jesus is a king, then yield to him. Sometimes that's harder than it sounds, isn't it? Have you ever felt like you're making headway painfully? Again, to borrow the language of this story. Not going anywhere. I don't know. There's something, we are bad kings. And I don't know why we try. I know I try sometimes to rule a roost. But I think the key is how we can relate to Jesus, yield to the King. Secondly, feast at his table. Take it in. Understand the loaves. There's a lot more than just bread flying around a field of grass. Guys are like, go deep. You know what I mean? They're feeding. There's more there than that. Feast at the table. Understand the bread. Again, more to come in the series. Lastly, let your heart beat with his life. I think a heart infused with the life of Jesus is softer. The hard heart tends to turn away, go its own way, but there's something in there. Jesus can soften that. That's the life of the world. Let your heart beat with his life. Let him in the boat. Okay, so in conclusion, I said I wanted to move from flashback to cliffhanger. Again, verse 52, they did not understand the loaves. Think about that. Meditate on that. Do you understand the loaves? In this episode, it's tricky. In the series, it really goes from black and white to color. And know this, Jesus came to them on the sea in their turmoil. This is the incarnation. Let him come to you. Let him fold his life into yours. If the waters are calmed, then you can be too. Let me end with this short prayer. King Jesus, help us understand the loaves and enliven our hearts. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.